So in the physical world, in the physical space, when there is a murder or there's any other crime, usually the understanding that we have is that, okay, there is evidence and then the criminal will be caught. Given the kind of background you have, if I don't ask you a question on electronic evidence, I know it's a separate topic of discussion altogether and a very long one at it, but just for the audience to understand that, the minute I go online does not mean I'm missing, and that that I cannot be tracked. So from the enforcement agency's point of view, if I do reach out and if I file a complaint, what are some of the things that are done for tracking a person?
Yeah. See, that's why I mentioned even earlier that these criminals think that they are somehow invisible. They don't have Harry Potter's invisibility cloak, as I always say. Electronic evidence, in fact, in my book, I've called it the breadcrumb trail. So I've used the Hansel and Gretel example there to say that the breadcrumb trail is always there. Never assume that the trail is not there. In fact, I tell people it's a lot easier to find the cyber criminal rather than the physical criminal, because, and as to take your example of murder itself, how would you find the criminal? You will have to first look for clues in the site and then talk to people, find out who all were seen around the CSI scene of murder, and then investigate them, question them, and then that's how it proceeds, right? And then the net expands. In an electronic crime, the advantage you have is the trail is already laid out for you. From point A to point B, you will be able to track it immediately. One of the earliest cybercrime cases, you will not find the reported judgment of this, unfortunately, but you will find a lot of news reports of it. The Suhas Katti case, where a person had put up a solicitor's message from a cyber cafe in Bombay about a Chennai girl, where her contact details were put up as if she was open for soliciting. She was soliciting for, a mail company and things like that. Okay. So in that case, I'm just giving this as an example to show the breadcrumb trail. Okay. So the Chennai police, in fact, the person who conducted this investigation was given a Cyber Cop award also by, in fact, we are in Bombay police, along with all of us who are in the cyber domain from very early days. In fact, I started in the cyber domain before India got its act, from 95 I've been involved, in 1995 I've been involved in this. So our whole initiative in Bombay and what we used to call as Cyber Safety Week. For 1 week in February, we used to conduct a lot of awareness programs across Bombay. We would cover students in schools and colleges, then housing societies, then industry verticals, then judiciary, then public prosecutors, and the gamut, the whole ecosystem. The whole idea was to spread the word of cyber safety. So what I'm doing now through Cyber Sati is not anything new that I'm doing. We've done a lot of it early days, but the difference is I realized, like how I was telling you about crime also, when you commit a crime in the physical world, the impact is contained. When you do take it to the digital world, it becomes more widespread. So similarly, I realized that to do a cyber safety week, we can still cover only so many people. Whereas with Cyber Sati, I thought I could cover several millions at one shot, and that's the scaling up I wanted to do with that. So anyway, the reason I was mentioning about the Cyber Safety Week also is to explain about the breadcrumb trail and whatever, right? So in that, one of the things, we had a competition for a cyber cop and all, and this gentleman won one of the awards. So he tracked the trail from Chennai to Bombay, but the trail went cold because a fake email ID was created, and then using the fake email ID, the online site, the solicitor's message was put up in a Yahoo site. All of this was done from a cyber cafe. Now, in those days, this was before the cyber cafe rules and all were formed. So there was nothing to show who could have done the crime. So the way the investigating officer took it further was to take it offline. So you cannot do investigation only with one methodology or the other. So I always tell people, whether it is police, judiciary, or industry, or whoever the audience may be, that you have to remember that first principles still apply. You know, you need your chain of custody. You have to show authenticity and integrity. You have to show the admissibility of evidence, everything. So never forget first principles. Never forget standard methodologies of investigation, because everything applies pari passu to electronic domains also. So here he went from the electronic trail then to the physical trail, found out who could be the suspects, then triangulated where the cyber cafe was closest to, between this girl's office and possible former colleague, because there were just two suspects at that time. And then they also did a stakeout, and they were able to find the victim. So in today's world, with even more evolved registry records and whatever, even if you're using a third-party resource, you can be tracked. And a lot of times people think that by just deleting their internet history or deleting certain content, they can get away with it. Again, if it is caught in time, it can be tracked, and that's why I use the Hansel and Gretel example. Because when it comes to electronic trails, you must be able to catch it at the earliest possible time. One more reason why victims should not delay taking recourse to law.
Fair point. And when it comes to WhatsApp chats, for example, a lot of people end up just deleting the WhatsApp chats, and they're also encrypted. So does it mean that those can be recovered if people have deleted, or they're gone forever?
No, it can be. It can be recovered. Again, people, they don't understand the whole encryption process of it. They don't realize that deleting something from a device does not mean it's deleted forever. But it can get deleted forever if it is overwritten. So again, that's why reach out for help at the earliest possible time, because then through forensics, you can recover this kind of content. Even deleted content can be recovered.
All right. I think that lends a lot of clarity. Just the last question on this entire topic, while there are a lot of laws, we have the Indian Penal Code as well, we have the Information Technology Act as well, and various provisions to kind of protect ourselves. And awareness on that is definitely important. But apart from that, in the day-to-day life, while we use, say, a platform like a LinkedIn or a Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, some of these most common platforms, are there any tips, that things people should keep in mind generally, not from a making a do's and don'ts kind of a thing, or say that the victim should keep in mind, but just for us to just be careful? Are there some things that we can do, and are there reporting mechanisms available?
Absolutely. Very important question. And yes, just because we, want to shy away from a do's and don'ts list doesn't mean that we will also shy away from cyber hygiene. So this is another thing which I have tried to take forward. If you look at the vision statement of Cybersati, I have specifically said this itself, that I do not wish to preach, but I only wish to guide. So we can take the horse to water. It's for the horse to decide whether it wants to drink or not thereafter, right? So similarly here, what I mean by cyber hygiene is, and sometimes, a lot of people get upset when I say this also, but I'm saying it in a very, how do I put it, in a very open-ended fashion, in the sense of, I would say, just think about what we would do in the real world and try and emulate that in the virtual world. And then they'll say, oh, but then you're restricting us. Not really. As I mentioned earlier, when somebody tells us, don't wear this dress or don't go somewhere, that is a restriction. When we evaluate what is safe and what is unsafe, and we decide for ourselves, this is what we are comfortable doing, this is what we will not do, or we are not comfortable doing, and we will follow that as a norm. So normative behavior changes through times. So for instance, that which was not permissible in my time is so normal in today's time that we don't even give it a second thought, right? So things like that. So in one instance, when I mentioned this and somebody contested it, and I just countered it with this example, I said that it is now normative behavior for everybody to accept any form of a swimsuit, including a bikini, in a beach or in a swimming pool. Nobody will turn an eye on that. But would you wear that and sit in your hall and greet visitors? Right? The same, and the reason I give this example is I'm purposely juxtaposing and reversing the thing to a public place versus a private domain. So the swimming pool is a public place and you may wear very skimpy clothes, but there's nothing wrong with that. But you yourself would not wear the same clothes in the privacy of your home when you're greeting guests. Why? Normative behavior, right? So similarly, I then explained that when I say that, exercise the same level of caution you would in the physical world, in the virtual world, the reason is because you would then evaluate what are the risks and threats in the virtual world, which is obviously different from that in the physical world. And then you will decide what is permissible, impermissible, or safe and unsafe. And even if you are taking an unsafe step, you will still do it knowingly. If you're doing it knowingly, it's fine. Yeah? You are ready to face the consequences. You know that is the way it is going to be, and you're willing to take that risk, which is fine. But knowingly, you would take that risk. But to just blindly rush forward merely because it's a digital domain, thinking everything is safe and I have absolute freedom, how dare anybody restrict me there, is not going to help anybody. So that's why I give this as the very simple and basic cautionary tale, which is exercise caution the same way you would in your everyday life, right? So what is the harm in that? That's not curtailment of your freedoms. It is the exercise of your freedoms in a judicious manner.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And also, as far as reporting on these various platforms are concerned, you'd mentioned that when the committee had sat, I think this also had come out from there, and that entire part has also changed now. And I believe that as part of that, today, if we go on Facebook or one of these platforms where there is any kind of, say, an abusive comment, etc., there is a possibility that we can report it and delete it also. Is the understanding correct?
Absolutely.
And that's an option through, I mean, in most of the platforms?
I want to clarify on the legal aspects of it, because a lot of people get confused with this particular aspect. So, earlier, the law was that when an intermediary, that is a social media platform, etc., is informed by the user or through a government order or a court order, they have to act on it within 36 hours.
Yes.
Now, after the decision of the Supreme Court in Shreya Singhal versus India, the first part of it was struck down, which is that the intermediary has to act within 36 hours, even if a user informs them. So this is where the confusion happens. When the court struck down that part, they did not say that the social media platform should not act on a user's information. They merely said that even where a social media platform does not act on the complaint from a user, they will not lose the protection under Section 79 of the IT Act, which colloquially we refer to as safe harbor provision, meaning any of these platforms are not responsible for content that is being uploaded by third parties, because they have no control. For just to give a simple example, Twitter has no control over what you're going to tweet. They can only check and remove afterwards, right? And they can't check and remove millions. They can't check several million tweets. That's what is happening probably in a minute, not even in a day, right? So what happens is, when something is brought to their notice, then they act on it. So what is bringing to their notice and when should they act on it was the issue before the Supreme Court. In fact, this was the same point we discussed a little earlier in the interview about balancing freedom of speech with victim rights. So the whole issue before the Supreme Court was that if they allowed for mandatory deletion of content merely because a user said this is defamatory of me, then that could amount to scuttling free speech. And therefore, they removed that and said only when it is a government order or a court order, then the intermediary has to necessarily remove the content. But that does not mean that the intermediary doesn't have to ask, and it certainly does not mean that a user cannot write to the intermediary. On many instances, and I can vouch for it because I have utilized this in many an occasion, every user, when they report to the social media platform, and the social media platforms do respond. It depends on the seriousness of the issue. So, for instance, in one case, an entire Facebook page was created, a fake Facebook page was created in the name of my client, and very defamatory, and this was not sexual and all that, just defamatory. And one could assume also that it was parody, but it was not really parody because there was nothing funny about it. They were just out to malign her. They couldn't put it in her site and all that, because if they do that, then that was getting blocked. Therefore, they created an absolute page in itself, and it started getting followers and this and that. And, progressively the kind of comments and the photographs being shared and all were very violative of her rights. Within, I think, about 3 days or 7 days of us sending the legal notice, this site was taken down. So action will be taken if a user approaches the social media platform. The only thing that Shreya Singhal said was that if the platform doesn't act on the notice, it doesn't take away their protective cloak. That's all. Because once the user writes to them and if the platform doesn't respond, then the only option available to the user is to go file a criminal complaint if it makes out a criminal offense, or go to a civil court and get an interim order. But it doesn't mean that in every case the user has to rush to government or court for an order.
Right. So I think this question about free speech versus defamation, I think this has been this can be a debate, forever, and it's a tough place to be in, because if you allow something, then it could be defamatory to someone, and if you don't allow it, you are curtailing someone's speech, and it's difficult to balance that. And I think from the intermediary's point of view, it's a difficult place to be in. But what you're saying is that if there is a user who is seeing especially abusive or sexual kind of content being put, they can definitely write to the intermediary, and then the intermediary needs to act. And if they still don't do it, then one can still reach out to government authorities, enforcement agencies, and get that looked into. So that's an option. But for an intermediary, do they always depend on users to report to them, or do they also have bots like AI, which they use to specifically look for certain words? For example, rape, it's a very common word, but one can report about rape also as a news article, and one can give rape threats also online. So would you have any experience of also seeing whether they use bots?
Yeah, so I don't want to get into whether they use bots or not very specifically. I'd rather because I have to treat the fine line here of not sharing information that may have been given in confidence. So this is the way I would put it. One, and this is available in public domain also. One of the ways that platforms ensure that offensive content is taken down, and it's the most effective way, which is because of human intervention, is the Trusted Flagger program. So each of these platforms identify organizations as trusted flaggers. So if they come across content like this, and particularly for child sexual abuse content, platforms are very, very careful to have proactive measures for that. So the trusted flaggers, when they write into a platform, action happens a lot faster. So the one thing that platforms could do going forward is to have a publicly available list of trusted flaggers, because that the advantage that users will then get is they will know whom to report it to other than the platform, and that will help the faster response from the platform. So that is one way of looking at it. The other aspect, which is what you were talking about in terms of artificial intelligence enabled tools. Again, I'm going to resort to what is available in public domain. Now, if you look at some of the news reports on what is evolving, particularly to root out hate speech and fake news, AI is being used to identify content. For instance, during COVID, there was one news article which said that Facebook had identified several million postings. So it will give you a warning. So if it feels that this may be offensive content, then it gives you a warning whether when you're posting it or when you're trying to forward the content, to say that you may be posting something which is illegal, and whether it may contain fake news, it may contain hate speech, etc. So these kind of warning messages and these kind of protective or preventive measures seem to have been evolved substantially over the last 3 years, particularly for fake news. So Twitter also has a similar program which has been talked about. So whether you call it a bot or you just call it AI, it's a technology-enabled process. So I would say that it can't be simplistic like putting a bot out for rape. If that were the case, then they're going to see the same problem of having to verify several million posts, because
Exactly.
as we pointed out, the news, it could be a news item about it. It could just be a movie scene or something like that, right? So they would have to evolve something a lot more advanced than that. But it is not impossible. It is feasible. There are studies which indicate it's feasible, and recent trends show that these are possible. My only concern, and I would like to put in that caution here, in fact, I have spoken about it in several of my talks also, is that any form of technology has to be used responsibly. It should not be subjected to abuse, because what happens is, merely because of fear of abuse otherwise, victims are being deprived of a very powerful tool of protection. So we need those checks and balances. I think we are now at a stage where we are going to require regulation specifically in terms of these kind of filtration tools to show what is permissible and what is impermissible, to balance free speech, but without impacting victim rights. It may sound utopian, but I personally believe that it is doable.
But that should be the hope also, right? I mean, how do you change things if you don't have that hope?
Absolutely.
So I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much, ma'am. It's been lovely speaking to you, and it's been a great learning experience as well. I've attended your sessions before also, and it's always been very, very, very interesting and enriching. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much again for having me here, Shivani.
Thank you. Bye bye.